The Pacific theater of World War II was unlike any other battleground of the 20th century. Imagine stepping onto a small island, the air thick with humidity, the ground torn apart by artillery shells, and the jungle pressing in on every side. American soldiers and Marines, burdened with heavy packs and rifles, pushed forward into landscapes that felt alive with danger. Every shadow could conceal a sniper, every hill might hide a machine gun nest, and every cave seemed to breathe with the resistance of determined defenders. The silence was deceptive, for within moments it could be shattered by a sudden burst of fire that erupted from an unseen position. In this world of hidden threats, the fight for survival was constant and unforgiving. The Japanese defenders had prepared their ground with an almost fanatical dedication. They built bunkers of thick logs, reinforced with earth and concrete, designed to withstand bombardments that shook the very ground. Many of these fortifications were cleverly camouflaged, nearly invisible, until the first shot rang out. Caves carved into volcanic rock became natural fortresses, immune to most conventional weapons. Artillery shells might thunder against their entrances, but when the smoke cleared, the defenders remained, ready to fight again. For the Americans, each encounter with these hidden strongholds was like colliding with an unyielding wall. The terrain magnified the danger. Dense jungle muffled sound, making it impossible to know what lay only a few yards ahead. Steep ridges and ravines forced attackers into narrow approaches, funnels where machine guns could cut down entire platoons. Heat and exhaustion drained the strength of men long before they reached the enemy's lines. The smell of cordite and rotting vegetation hung in the air, a constant reminder of battles already fought and the ones still to come. Soldiers often described the Pacific as a place where death could emerge without warning, sudden and absolute. Amid this unforgiving landscape, the American infantry had to adapt. Grenades and rifles, the basic tools of the soldier, often proved inadequate against positions buried in stone or fortified with layers of logs. Mortars and artillery softened the defenses but rarely eliminated them. Each time a stronghold remained intact, the price was measured in the lives of men who had to charge forward under withering fire. To break the stalemate, something more was required, a weapon that could reach into the darkness of bunkers and caves where bullets and shells could not. The need for a new approach grew urgent as the island campaigns intensified. It was here, in this deadly setting, that the flamethrower entered the stage. Its appearance was both strange and terrifying. On the back of a soldier, two heavy fuel tanks gleamed in the sun, connected by thick hoses to a steel wand that looked more like an instrument of science than of war. When triggered, it unleashed a stream of burning liquid that lit up the battlefield with a roar and a searing light. For the men who carried it, the flamethrower was both a lifeline and a curse, a weapon that could end a fight quickly, but also made its operator a prime target. Still, for their comrades, its presence meant hope. The first time many soldiers witnessed a flamethrower in action, they remembered it for the rest of their lives. The sudden burst of fire transformed the battlefield. The roar drowned out the rattle of machine guns, the flames cast long shadows across the jungle floor, and the smoke curled upward in thick, choking clouds. Inside a bunker, defenders who had resisted every other weapon now faced the one thing they could not ignore. Within moments, positions that had seemed unbreakable collapsed into silence. To the Americans, it was as if they had finally found a way to drag their hidden enemy into the open. Yet, the arrival of the flamethrower was not only about tactics, it was also about survival. For a Marine pinned down by fire from an unseen cave, the knowledge that a flamethrower team was moving forward brought both reassurance and dread. Reassurance, because it meant the position might soon be cleared. Dread, because the weapon's power left nothing untouched, consuming everything in its path. The Pacific campaign was already brutal, and the use of fire magnified that brutality in ways that haunted those who witnessed it. This was the early context of the flamethrower in World War II. In the Pacific, where every inch of ground was contested with unyielding ferocity, It became the answer to a question that had no easy solution. It was not a tool of elegance, but of necessity, born from the unforgiving struggle between two determined forces. The jungles, caves, and fortresses of the islands demanded a weapon capable of ending fights that might otherwise drag on at terrible cost. The flamethrower filled that role, and in doing so, it shaped the course of battles in a theater defined by endurance, desperation, and fire. The brutal contest in the Pacific soon revealed the stark difference between conventional weapons and the terrifying efficiency of the flamethrower. Imagine a Marine squad pinned down outside a Japanese bunker, the air filled with the snapping sound of bullets striking tree trunks and the metallic ping of ricochets. Rifles spat fire, grenades exploded at the bunker's entrance, and mortars thudded from behind the lines. Yet the defenders remained untouched and unshaken within their fortress of earth and stone. The firefight could drag on for hours, costing lives with every attempt to break through. Conventional firepower, no matter how relentless, often failed to reach the enemy hidden deep inside. The contrast was shocking. A flamethrower team could move into position under covering fire, aim the nozzle at the bunker's opening, and unleash a torrent of burning liquid. Within seconds, the battle that had seemed impossible shifted. Fire roared into the structure, filling every crevice with heat and smoke. Defenders who had shrugged off grenades and shells were suddenly confronted with a weapon that consumed the very air they breathed. The silence that followed was both eerie and devastating, a reminder of the weapon's terrible finality. For the American infantry, this difference meant survival. Without the flamethrower, soldiers were often forced into direct assaults, charging bunkers at the cost of many lives. With it, positions that had once required hours of costly fighting could be neutralized in minutes. The contrast between the two approaches was not lost on those who witnessed it. Men who had lost comrades in previous battles understood immediately what this new weapon could mean. The flamethrower became not only a tool of destruction, but also a means of preserving the lives of fellow soldiers. For the Japanese defenders, the difference was terrifying. Their bunkers had been designed to resist bullets, grenades, and artillery, and for a time they seemed invincible. But fire was an enemy they could not outlast. The moment flames poured into their positions, the illusion of safety vanished. Even those determined to fight to the death found themselves forced into impossible choices: suffocate inside, burn alive, or flee into the open under American guns. The shock of this reality marked a turning point in the psychological balance of the war. The battlefield itself bore witness to this transformation. Before the arrival of flamethrower teams, fights for bunkers often turned into drawn-out duels of attrition, with American troops wearing down defenders one grenade or rifle burst at a time. Afterward, the tempo of combat changed. A fortified position might fall in minutes, the outcome decided in a single fiery strike. Soldiers who had once dreaded approaching yet another cave or pillbox began to advance with a renewed sense of possibility. The difference between failure and success could now be measured in the presence of one man carrying tanks of fuel on his back. This contrast did not go unnoticed by commanders either. Tactical reports began to highlight the effectiveness of flamethrowers, noting how they succeeded where other weapons had failed. The new strategy was clear. Instead of wasting precious time and lives in prolonged firefights, send in the flamethrower teams. Their results could be counted in reduced casualties and faster advances, though always at the cost of leaving behind scenes of destruction that haunted all who saw them. In the grim arithmetic of war, fire had proven itself the decisive element. The shock value of the flamethrower extended far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers described in their letters home the strange mixture of relief and horror that came with its use. Relief because the weapon ended fights that seemed unwinnable. Horror because of the images burned into their minds of what fire did to human beings. For the Japanese defenders, the flamethrower represented a new kind of terror, one that undermined the fierce confidence they had placed in their fortifications. The contrast between the old ways of fighting and this new reality was undeniable, and both sides had to face its consequences. In the end, The conflict between conventional arms and the flamethrower's terrifying efficiency reshaped the very rhythm of combat. The difference was not subtle, it was absolute. Where rifles and grenades chipped away at defenses, the flamethrower obliterated them. Where artillery thundered without effect, fire consumed everything it touched. This contrast became one of the defining features of the Pacific War, a grim reminder that in the desperate struggle for survival, innovation often came cloaked in both fear and flame. The appearance of the flamethrower on the battlefields of the Pacific did not happen by chance. It was the result of a growing recognition within the U.S. military that conventional weapons alone could not dislodge an enemy so deeply entrenched. By the time the campaigns reached places like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, it was clear that something had to change. American infantry had faced situations where artillery bombardments shook the earth for hours, yet when the dust settled, the Japanese defenders emerged to fire again. The frustration of fighting an enemy who seemed untouchable fueled the demand for a new kind of weapon. The flamethrower became the answer to that demand. The weapon itself had existed in earlier forms, but its deployment in the Pacific gave it a new significance. Unlike the rifles or machine guns that every soldier carried, the flamethrower was not a weapon for mass distribution. It required specific training, careful handling, and immense courage. The device was heavy and unwieldy, its tanks filled with flammable fuel strapped to the operator's back. The man carrying it was both indispensable and highly vulnerable. Every step he took closer to an enemy bunker carried the risk of drawing concentrated fire, for the enemy knew that if he reached his target, the battle could be lost in an instant. Flamethrower teams were often formed with a mix of volunteers and selected men, chosen for their steadiness under pressure. They trained not only to handle the weapon, but to operate in coordination with their squads. A flamethrower operator rarely moved alone. Riflemen provided cover, suppressing enemy fire as the operator advanced. Engineers and support troops ensured the tanks were maintained and ready. The act of carrying fire into battle was not just a solitary burden, but a collective effort woven into the larger tactics of infantry assault. The psychological burden on these men was immense. Imagine walking toward a bunker, hearing bullets whistle past, knowing that every enemy inside had their eyes fixed on you. The tanks on your back were not only fuel, but a target, and a single shot could turn you into a living torch. Yet, despite this danger, flamethrower operators advanced again and again, driven by the knowledge that their role was critical. They were the tip of the spear in battles, where progress depended on breaking through defenses that nothing else could touch. The origins of this role reflected the desperate improvisation of war. Commanders quickly realized that flamethrowers were more than experimental tools. They were practical answers to the specific problems of the Pacific terrain. Caves, pillboxes, and underground tunnels could not be neutralized with ordinary firepower, but fire could reach into the darkness, filling spaces with heat and smoke that drove defenders out or left them incapacitated. In this way, the flamethrower was not just another weapon, it was a solution to the unique challenges of island warfare. The men chosen to carry the flamethrower developed reputations among their peers. They were both respected and pitied, admired for their courage, yet recognized as marked men. In the harsh calculus of war, they carried the greatest risk for the chance of the greatest reward. Their actions often determined whether an assault stalled or succeeded. For their fellow soldiers, the presence of a flamethrower team meant hope in the face of stubborn resistance, even as it also meant witnessing scenes of combat more brutal than any they had imagined. In tracing the background of these teams, one sees how necessity shaped innovation. The flamethrower was not born of ambition or technological curiosity, but of the harsh demands of battle. It grew out of the realization that the enemy's determination and fortifications required an answer as uncompromising as the war itself. By the time it was fully integrated into U.S. tactics, it had become an inseparable part of the infantry's assault strategy. Its origins were rooted in the grim reality of a conflict where survival demanded tools capable of breaking even the strongest defenses. The story of the flamethrower's background is thus not just about a weapon, but about the men who carried it and the conditions that made it essential. It is a story of adaptation, of soldiers confronting problems that rifles and shells could not solve, and of commanders willing to embrace fire as a weapon of war. In the jungles and caves of the Pacific, the flamethrower was born into its full purpose, and its legacy began with the courage of those who carried it into the darkest places of the battlefield. When the flamethrower first appeared in actual combat in the Pacific, its effect was immediate and unforgettable. Imagine a squad advancing through the jungle, pinned down by enemy fire from a concealed bunker. Grenades had been thrown, machine guns had raked the entrance, and mortars had pounded the position, but still the defenders held firm. Then, a flamethrower operator crawled forward under the cover of his comrades. With a squeeze of the trigger, a stream of burning liquid erupted from the nozzle, shooting into the bunker with a roar like a furnace. The effect was devastating. In seconds, the resistance that had seemed unbreakable was silenced. On the battlefield, these moments brought a kind of stunned relief to American troops. Soldiers who had expected hours of bloody fighting found themselves advancing within minutes. The roar of the flames drowned out gunfire, and the acrid smoke rose into the humid air, marking the sudden collapse of enemy positions. Men who had been pinned down in the dirt stood and moved forward, their way cleared by fire. The contrast between frustration and sudden victory was so sharp that it left a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. For many, the flamethrower seemed less like a weapon and more like a force of nature, untamed and absolute. But the impact was not only physical, it was deeply psychological. Japanese defenders, who had been drilled to hold their ground against bullets, shells, and bayonets, now faced something beyond endurance. Fire invaded the very spaces they had carved out as sanctuaries. The heat consumed the air, the smoke filled their lungs, and the flames curled into corners where no soldier could hide. Those who survived the initial burst often fled, stumbling into the open where waiting riflemen cut them down. For many, the knowledge that flamethrower teams were on the battlefield undermined the confidence they once placed in their fortifications. The brutal efficiency of the flamethrower changed the tempo of assaults. Instead of prolonged firefights costing dozens of lives, fortified positions fell swiftly. This shift allowed American units to maintain momentum, pushing deeper into contested ground before defenders could regroup. Commanders began to integrate flamethrower teams into their battle plans, recognizing that they could open the door for broader advances. The presence of even a single operator often dictated the rhythm of combat, turning what might have been a stalemate into rapid movement across the battlefield. Still, the impact came at a cost. The destruction left behind was total, and those who witnessed it carried the memory long after the fight was over. Soldiers described the smell of burning fuel mixed with jungle rot, the sight of smoke billowing from once quiet caves, and the eerie silence that followed a flamethrower strike. For the operators themselves, the weight of what they carried was not only physical, but moral. They knew their weapon offered no mercy, and they lived with the knowledge that each time they pulled the trigger, they changed the nature of the fight in a way that could not be undone. For the enemy, the sight of a flamethrower operator approaching was enough to break even the strongest resolve. Soldiers who had resisted with fanatical determination often abandoned their posts when the nozzle appeared. The threat of fire was more than a military tactic. It was a psychological weapon that turned courage into fear. In this way, the flamethrower did more than destroy fortifications. It shattered the spirit of those who defended them. Its presence on the battlefield ensured that even the strongest positions were vulnerable. The impact of the flamethrower was therefore twofold. It reshaped tactics and it reshaped minds. It gave American troops a weapon that could end battles in moments, reducing casualties and allowing progress where once there had been deadlock. At the same time, it introduced a new level of terror into the fighting, one that marked both sides deeply. In the Pacific, where every hill, cave, and bunker was contested with ferocity, The flamethrower stood as a weapon that embodied both the savagery and the necessity of the war. In the end, its impact was not measured only in destroyed bunkers or captured ground, but in the memory of those who saw it in action. For the infantrymen, it meant survival in situations that had seemed hopeless. For the defenders, it meant facing the one weapon they could not outlast. And for history, it meant a transformation in the way battles were fought, a reminder that in the struggle for survival, war often turns to the most primal of forces: fire itself. The flamethrower's influence on the Pacific battlefield extended far beyond the destruction of bunkers and caves. Its presence reshaped the psychology of both armies, altering how soldiers fought and how they thought about the fight itself. For the Japanese defenders, who had relied on the seeming invincibility of their fortifications, the weapon represented a shattering truth. No position was safe. Even the most carefully constructed stronghold could be penetrated by a burst of flame that devoured oxygen and filled tunnels with choking smoke. The terror of fire seeped into their morale, breaking down the fierce determination that had once made them so difficult to dislodge. For American soldiers, the weapon brought a different kind of consequence. It provided relief in the heat of battle, yet it also carried with it a sense of unease. Watching a bunker fall silent after being engulfed in fire was both reassuring and horrifying. Men understood that the flamethrower saved lives by preventing prolonged assaults, but they also knew its destruction was absolute. Letters home from veterans spoke in hushed tones of the scenes they had witnessed, the smoke, the smell, the silence after. The weapon ended fights, but it left scars on the minds of those who saw its effects. Tactically, the consequences were profound. Once commanders realized how effective flamethrower teams could be, they began to integrate them into every stage of island assaults. Plans for amphibious landings and inland advances increasingly relied on flamethrowers to crack open defenses quickly. Riflemen and machine gunners coordinated to protect operators, engineers made sure fuel supplies were always at hand, and units adapted their maneuvers around the moment when fire would clear the way. The flamethrower was no longer a tool of desperation. It became a central element in the combined arms strategy of the Pacific Campaign. This shift also meant that Japanese strategies had to adapt. Fortifications, once thought secure, now needed greater depth, more hidden exits, or even sacrificial counterattacks aimed at eliminating flamethrower operators before they could strike. The battlefield became a chessboard of fear and adaptation, with each side trying to anticipate the other. Yet, in this contest, the Americans often gained the upper hand, for fire was a weapon that defenders could rarely endure for long. The consequences of this imbalance tilted battles toward swifter American victories, changing the tempo of the campaign itself. The wider consequences also reached into the realm of morale. For American troops, the knowledge that flamethrower teams were part of their ranks gave them confidence in the face of the enemy's elaborate defenses. Battles that once seemed endless now had an answer. The sight of flame shooting into a bunker often lifted the spirits of men who had been pinned down, reminding them that no enemy position was truly untouchable. At the same time, this confidence carried a darker edge, for many knew that survival now came at the cost of unleashing one of the most terrifying weapons of the war. The use of fire also raised questions of humanity in the midst of conflict. Some soldiers admitted that the flamethrower felt different from rifles or artillery. It was not a distant strike or a faceless exchange of fire. It was personal, direct, and overwhelming. To wield it meant to confront the enemy in his most protected space and leave nothing untouched. These reflections spread quietly among veterans, shaping the way they remembered their service. The consequences were not only tactical but moral, leaving men to wrestle with memories long after the war was over. In terms of broader outcomes, the effectiveness of flamethrowers helped the U.S. advance more rapidly through the Pacific Islands. Each stronghold that fell quickly saved lives and resources, allowing the campaign to maintain momentum toward its ultimate goals. The wider war effort benefited from the speed with which defenses could be neutralized. making the weapon not just a battlefield innovation, but a strategic advantage. At the same time, its use became one of the most haunting aspects of the conflict, remembered by friend and foe alike as a symbol of both fear and finality. Thus, the wider consequences of the flamethrower's use stretched beyond the smoke and flames of battle. It reshaped morale, tactics, and the pace of the war itself. It gave American troops a weapon that combined effectiveness with terror, and it stripped defenders of the confidence they had once placed in their fortifications. In the story of the Pacific Campaign, its impact was undeniable, not only in the ground gained, but in the hearts and minds of those who fought. It was a reminder that in the crucible of war, even the tools of victory could carry a cost far deeper than the battlefield. As the Pacific Campaign reached its most intense stages, the role of the flamethrower became impossible to ignore. Battles on islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima pushed both sides to their limits. Japanese defenses had grown deeper, more elaborate, and more determined than ever before. Fortified caves honeycombed entire mountains. Bunkers were layered in complex networks, and tunnels allowed defenders to appear and vanish like ghosts. American commanders faced the grim reality that conventional bombardments, no matter how massive, could not fully neutralize such positions. It was in this crucible that flamethrower teams stepped into their defining role. On Iwo Jima, the battle epitomized this climax. The volcanic island was a fortress riddled with more than 1,000 bunkers, tunnels, and hidden gun positions. Marines advancing across its black sands encountered fire from every angle, machine guns cutting them down from pillboxes invisible to the naked eye. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards, each one costing blood. In this environment, flamethrower operators became the key to unlocking the Japanese defenses. They advanced under fire, their fuel tanks heavy on their backs, their lives dependent on the protection of their comrades. When they reached their targets, they transformed the battlefield with a single squeeze of the trigger. The effect was undeniable. Where artillery shells had cratered the earth without silencing the enemy, the flamethrower brought immediate and total destruction. Marines watched in awe and relief as once defiant positions collapsed into silence within seconds. Defenders who had held their ground with fanatical determination were forced into the open or perished in the flames. The island's labyrinth of defenses, once thought impenetrable, began to fall bunker by bunker, cave by cave. The weapon's presence turned hopeless stalemates into sudden victories, allowing the American advance to continue. For the Japanese, this moment was catastrophic. Their strategy had relied on the strength of their fortifications and the willingness of their soldiers to die within them. The flamethrower stripped away both. Fire robbed them of their sanctuaries, and the prospect of burning alive eroded even the most fanatical resolve. Some still fought to the last, but others fled positions they would once have defended to the death. The terror of flame spread faster than the fire itself, undermining morale and unraveling carefully prepared defenses. For American troops, the climax of the flamethrower's role was both empowering and unsettling. They could finally break through defenses that had cost so many lives, and they could advance with greater speed and security. Yet, they also witnessed scenes that seared themselves into memory. The roar of the flames, the choking smoke, and the silence that followed were unlike anything produced by rifles or artillery. Soldiers spoke of an eerie stillness after a strike, as though the battlefield itself paused to acknowledge the devastation. These moments left behind a mix of gratitude for survival and a haunting awareness of the weapon's brutal power. By the time the Pacific Campaign neared its end, the flamethrower had become indispensable. Commanders no longer considered it an experimental weapon, but a critical part of their arsenal. Every major assault relied on flamethrower teams to clear the way for infantry to move forward. The climax of its use was not a single moment, but a series of battles where its presence decided the outcome. Without it, the cost of each island might have been even greater, the toll in American lives higher, and the advance toward Japan far slower. The peak of the flamethrower's role thus came at the point where the war itself demanded the most from both sides. The Japanese fought with unyielding ferocity, and the Americans responded with every tool available to break through. In that struggle, the flamethrower stood out as the weapon that tipped the balance. It cleared bunkers in minutes, reduced fortresses to silence, and reshaped the way the war was fought. The climax of its story was written not only in fire, but in the changed faces of the men who carried it, and the altered landscape of the Pacific Islands where it burned. In those climactic battles, the flamethrower became a symbol of both innovation and desperation, of survival and destruction. It was the instrument that allowed American forces to press forward, but it was also a reminder of the terrible cost of total war. The Pacific Campaign demanded absolute commitment, and the flamethrower delivered absolute results. Its role at the height of the fighting was the moment when its power became undeniable, shaping the outcome of battles and leaving a legacy that would be remembered long after the fires themselves had faded. When the war finally ended, the memory of the flamethrower teams lingered like smoke that refused to clear. These men had carried one of the most fearsome weapons of the conflict, and their role could not be forgotten. For many veterans, the image of a flamethrower in action was burned into memory. The roar of igniting fuel, the rush of heat, the thick clouds of black smoke curling upward from the ruins of a bunker. It was a sound and sight unlike any other, a reminder that in the Pacific, survival often depended on unleashing the most primal of forces. The men who carried those tanks bore not just the weight of the weapon, but also the moral burden of its devastation. For the U.S. military, the flamethrower came to symbolize both ingenuity and the grim necessities of total war. It had been introduced as a tool of survival, a response to fortifications that no rifle or mortar could break. But it quickly became a central part of the American arsenal in the Pacific, shaping tactics and accelerating the campaign. At the same time, its reputation carried a shadow. The weapon was effective, but it was also terrifying, raising questions about the nature of warfare itself. To those who saw it used, it was never just a machine. It was an experience of fire and fear that changed the way they viewed combat. The legacy of the flamethrower also extended into how battles were remembered. Veterans spoke of the strange mixture of relief and horror they felt when the weapon was used. Relief because it saved the lives of countless Americans by ending fights quickly. Horror because it revealed the absolute brutality that modern war could unleash. For the Japanese defenders, the memory was darker still, for fire robbed them of their most trusted defenses and forced them into impossible choices. The legacy was not just tactical, but emotional, carried in the stories of survivors on both sides. Over time, the weapon was phased out, replaced by more precise and less dangerous tools. Napalm strikes from aircraft, demolitions, and new engineering tactics took over the role of clearing bunkers and caves. Yet the image of the man with tanks of fuel strapped to his back remained a powerful symbol of the Pacific War. He was both a figure of fear to the enemy and a figure of fragile hope to his comrades. His presence could mean the difference between another bloody stalemate and a sudden breakthrough. In the memory of the campaign, he became inseparable from the story of victory. The closing chapter of the flamethrower's role is one of complexity. It was a weapon that saved lives while taking them in the most terrifying way imaginable. It was born of necessity, shaped by the brutal demands of the Pacific, and retired as technology advanced beyond its design. Yet its impact on those who fought and those who faced it remains enduring. To speak of the Pacific Campaign without mentioning the flamethrower is to leave out one of its defining instruments of war. In legacy, the flamethrower stands as a reminder of both the extremes of human innovation and the extremes of human desperation. It represents the way war strips away illusions and forces men to confront survival in its rawest form. The U.S. flamethrower teams did not just clear bunkers, they changed the rhythm of battle and left a mark on military history that cannot be erased. Their story is one of fire and steel, of courage and dread. and of the unrelenting struggle to prevail in a war fought with total commitment. Thus, the final memory of the flamethrower is not only in the bunkers it burned or the islands it helped secure. It lives in the faces of the men who carried it, in the whispered recollections of veterans who saw its effects, and in the history books that record its role. The Pacific Theater was a place where survival demanded brutal choices, and the flamethrower was the weapon that embodied that reality. Its closing legacy is both fearsome and undeniable, a story of fire that forever shaped the way we remember the war.